Thank you all for coming. I'm going to read a few passages from my new book, New Orleans Remix, and hopefully we can have some discussion afterwards. These are passages from various chapters of the book, and here we go. This is from the introduction. Since Louis Moreau Gottschalk transcribed African slave drumming in Congo Square, New Orleans has ignited America's hottest sounds. Many books have investigated New Orleans music by re-invoking the cradle of jazz myth. NOLA emerges here the way many tourists envision it, as the home of quaint old guys playing Dixieland in Preservation Hall, keeping alive the ghosts of Louis Armstrong and Sidney Bechet. Other books celebrate the laid-back ambiance bequeathed by the French, the exotic world of Lafcadio Hearn and Tennessee Williams, with traditional jazz as the backdrop. Fetishizing the past is a long-standing New Orleans trope, and why not, since its traditions are so seductive and special. Meantime, far off the mainstream radar, the real New Orleans rocks on, supported by an avid local audience. Artists little known to the general public, Arla Dixon, David Torkanowski, Shamar Allen, Topsy Chapman, Aurora Nealon, to name a few, are pioneering new sounds layered on NOLA traditions. Funk, hip-hop, brass bands, Zydeco, hot club gypsy, and avant-garde groups are rocketing the city in neighborhood bars far from the Bourbon Street tourist scene. Even neo-traditional jazz artists like Leon Brown, Gerald French, and the Shotgun Jazz Band have emerged in startling numbers, making the old sound new for a younger generation. This book addresses what is really happening every day, not just at Mardi Gras and Jazz Fest in America's musical capital. I've been traveling to New Orleans from my home in New York since the 1980s, and it was in the 90s that I noticed things really starting to change. Comparing New York to New Orleans, Jason Marsalis, whose family is a microcosm of the changing scene, told me that for a serious musician in the 1980s, New Orleans was not part of the discussion. Quote, it was not even on the table. The Big Easy was losing many of its finest players to the Big Apple. Quote, a lot of that was solidified when Wynton and Branford moved to New York and their careers really took off, and it became, that's where you gotta go. Now all that has changed. Jazz gets the longest chapter in this book, but like the others, it's a variation on the larger theme of New Orleans music rather than a separate component. Much of the music's charm lies in its casual resistance to the restrictions of any single genre. The music is all relative, says Leroy Jones, trumpet player. Just play, just interpret the tune, don't get all choked up and confused about a, quote, concept, unquote. For banjoist Chris Edmonds, it's all part of one stream, not just jazz, but, quote, funk, Professor Longhair, Fats. We really call it different things. We really don't call it different things, sorry. We regard it as New Orleans music. For funk master John Cleary, quote, jazz is the first one. That's where it all came from. But these are just labels. The songs I write are for all facets of my personality. I'm a good sponge. The reality of New Orleans is that everybody has such amazing misinformation about it because it's so separate from the rest of America that bands are telling me all the time things like people think we're still underwater from Katrina, and they have to inform them that that's not true. The only flood in New Orleans, of course, is the flood of new immigrants who are coming in from everywhere from Tokyo to Nashville. And that's one of the things this book is about, is whether those new immigrants, mostly young people, lots of Asians, lots of Hispanics, whether they are preserving the traditions and layering something new onto them and respecting them, or if they're imposing alien values on those traditions. And that's one of the controversies the book addresses. This is from chapter 3 now. That was all from the introduction. This is from chapter 3, the brass bands partying at funerals. The hottest gig in contemporary New Orleans is the Rebirth Brass Band at the Maple Leaf on Tuesday nights. It's been that way since the early 90s, one of the few constants in the Big Easy. Not that the show is orderly in any way. Hundreds of locals begin crowding in at 9:30 or 10 for a performance that everyone knows won't start till 11:30 or midnight or whenever all 9 Rebirth members wander in from the trim act. I'm reading a passage about the Rebirth Brass Band. That's okay. By showtime, it's nearly impossible to bring a drink to the bar at the front into the narrow New Orleans red hallway under the stage where the crowd is thronging. Once the Rebirth Band is completely present, they start playing without introduction and keep on going as one number rockets into another through the night. The club is claustrophobic and hot, with no place to stand comfortably, forget sitting, and little space to dance or drink, though fans manage to do plenty of both. Few fans care about any of this, but those who do can stay for 30 minutes or so and feel satisfied, indeed satiated. Most stay all night, their ears ringing through the next day as they recover from a unique musical high. It's partly the sound of the Rebirth itself, blaring, joyful, aggressively direct, yet highly sophisticated in its crisscrossing counterpoint and multi-layered chords. Stunningly loud, yet rich rather than hard. But it's more than the music. Essential to the Maple Leaf Tuesday night gig is the audience, which gives back as much energy as it gets, inspiring the band to keep rocking at all costs. That's why the show is better at the Maple Leaf than, say, Brooklyn Bowl, where I've heard the band do spirited but somehow unremarkable gigs. Phil Frazier, Sousa player and leader of the band, told me it's because the audience knows the repertory and expects more than just a run-through in New Orleans. In New Orleans, the attitude is, we know how good you is, now show us how good you is. Even if it's the same songs, it sounds different. Currently, the city is rocked by the jubilant sounds of the New Wave Brass Band, the Stooges, the Little Rascals, the Baby Boys, and dozens of others. Funky innovation is the trend, but some groups, notably Treme, New Tuxedo, and Deja Vu, are standard bearers for the tradition. Breaking through the barriers in a male-dominated form are 2 all-female Pinettes brass bands, the Pinettes and the original Pinettes, who've been blasting their way through town in a new wave of popularity after a slow start in the 1990s. The Pinettes have a pop-infused repertory yoked to traditional tunes, emphasizing vocals far more than other brass bands. The band has a powerful female aura that's new to brass bands. The new sound is a recent thing, says trumpet player Veronique Dorsey, but the original band has existed since 1991 with alumni of St. Mary's Academy. The band director decided to create a brass band to help parents out with money, and it hasn't stopped since. I've heard the Pinettes in their regular gig at Bullet Sports Lounge in the 7th Ward, a tiny joint with a big heart and a happy atmosphere. The drums and sousaphones start the show while Angelica Joseph exhorts people to join the party. At her command, everybody gets up and dances around the cramped tables. It's impossible not to. Singers blend with brass in a sensual current. We do a lot of chanting and singing, says Jourdain. When we play, it sounds like someone singing. That's what we shoot for. That is what Louis Armstrong shot for as well. The tradition of horn players sounding like singers is still alive and well. This is an excerpt from the jazz chapter now. The quintessential street player is Kermit Ruffins, making music for his fans and passing what he's learned on the street to others. He embodies New Orleans history in a precise way, playing for tips in Jackson Square as a kid, helping launch the Rebirth Brass Band in high school, and finally moving on to his own career as an avatar of swing. John Blanchard, the owner of Rock and Bowl, says that, quote, for Kermit, it's not about being better than anybody else. He has a childlike charisma. He's very innocent. One of my students told me that he was struck by the way, quote, Kermit just comes in the door with the people when he shows up for a gig. There are no handlers or entourages, none of the pretentious trappings of celebrity. He's there to have a good time, and he shows it overtly, toasting the crowd with a celebratory bottle of beer, though he's perfectly happy with colleagues who adopt a more abstemious manner. And this is a quote from Kermit Ruffins: "The cat who looks serious while he's playing is having just as much fun as the cat who cuts up and drinks beer on the stage. It's the way you're brought up." Leroy Jones represents another type of musician. This is the trumpet player now. The one who begins with a street band aesthetic, then moves on to a more classical sound. The legacy of opera and Creole song. There's a chapter in the book on opera, which I think is the most underreported story of New Orleans music. It's one of the first opera companies in the New World, and many, many premieres that are attributed to the Metropolitan Opera of where I live really started in New Orleans. Jones is somebody who's very influenced by opera. Jones has a buttery sonority in both his trumpet and voice, as if they're two aspects of the same instrument. It's a legato style achieved through arduous study and practice. One can hear 50 gigs, whether traditional or modern, and never hear an inelegant phrase or a choppy line. This is from a chapter now called Stomping and Studying, the Two Cultures of Jazz. And I think you'll gather from the context what stomping means and what studying means. The stompers can ignite the studiers. That's their mission. I remember Trombone Shorty playing a show at Snug Harbor, a place known for sit-down decorum. This was the period just before Shorty's rise to international stardom. His big eyes blazing, he told me before the show, "We're going to make this place rock," and that's what he did. Perpetually in motion, leaping and dancing, waving trombone and trumpet, bounding from stage to balcony as he exhorted the audience to scream and call a response, he transformed Snug Harbor into a crazy party. People leapt from their tiny tables and danced to Troy's horn lines, which rocketed up to the rafters or rained down from them seconds later, a kind of solo antiphony. It didn't seem like Snug Harbor, and the managers were visibly discomfited, though not the young waiters who were having a blast. A set at Snug Harbor only lasts an hour, but the out-of-context intensity made the evening seem blissfully longer. The same thing can happen anywhere. Donald Harrison and Henry Butler recently played a long set of post-bop at New York's Iridium Club. Clearly, the band thought this was what a sophisticated New York crowd would want to hear. Near the end of the evening, Henry Butler finally said, "Let's get direct," bursting into a joyful medley of traditional jazz and Mardi Gras Indian music. The audience, dutifully solemn and studious throughout the evening, suddenly broke out into cheers, applause, and screaming. A library turned into a party. For better or worse, jazz is now both. And this is from a chapter on the clubs. There's a chapter called Sacred Ground, and this is a little paragraph on the Frenchman Street scene, which is, people are saying that the Frenchman Street scene now is what Bourbon Street was in the Louis Armstrong era. Frenchman Street is an Ivesian cacophony of brass bands, bluegrass fiddlers, rappers, and gospel singers, crisscrossing and converging. I remember the beautiful quiet of the street in the early 1990s, with the sambas from Cafe Brazil echoing out into an empty silence, occasionally punctuated by more discreet emanations from Cafe Istanbul, exotic outliers from the central Snug Harbor, whose more cerebral, modern beat in the back of the house could not be heard on the street at all. The Frenchman area is more compact and circumscribed than the Bourbon Street scene from the early 20th century, but rich in repertory and possibility. It's becoming a place where one can experience the history of jazz as well as its many variants and contemporary manifestations while only roaming a few blocks. And what's remarkable about Frenchman Street is it's really very small. It seems like it's huge, but it's about 3 blocks. This is the final chapter. It's called After the Flood. And what I'm going to read to you is a section that connects with this class I teach in college called New Orleans, that I bring students down every January for a trip where I'm joined by my wonderful brother, Brian, who just walked in the door. And when Hurricane Katrina struck, the dean's office wondered why I was going down to a city that was underwater. And I said, because I can't bear to not go down. So he made me wait a few months until things were up and running, which was a smart thing to ask me to do, actually. So, but I still went when things were pretty much catastrophic, but not completely. And I just had an instinct that it would be okay, at least the music would be okay. At first it appeared that doomsayers might be right. People were saying the music was over and would never be back. I've never seen that. A lot of people said that. When we arrived, the airport was a ghostly shell, especially dismaying for a Saturday, and the city streets were empty. Even the French Quarter had an eerie tranquility. The smell of stale beer and vomit on Bourbon Street was shockingly absent.
It's a vivid picture.
But the minute we got into the clubs, everything burst into life, and it was clear that New Orleans was not over. The best of the splendid little dives, Vaughn's, Donna's, the Maple Leaf, Rock and Roll, Snug Harbor, the Spotted Cat, DBA were all up and running and packed with exultant, grateful locals. Even Bourbon Street, in its tawdry indestructibility, played a significant role in the recovery, proving that the music was not dead. Its crowds and noise were dramatically diminished, but some of the clubs were still alive, and I remember experiencing a strange intimacy, all the more attractive for being so out of context. As early as October, Big Al Carson was back in business, a larger-than-life premonition of good times to come. I heard Fats Domino's guitar player, Les Getrix, perform for two people, one of them myself, in a desolate, half-ruined bar, a haunting and beautiful experience. Local after local reminded me that this city has survived not only corrupt politicians, yellow fever, bubonic plague, two all-consuming fires, and numerous floods. Nonetheless, the life-affirming spirit of the music, the jazz funeral tradition of looking death in the eye and then partying anyway, was intact, with the tragic backdrop of the hurricane adding a subtle poignance. DeVille Crawford's rendition of Amazing Grace, caressed by piano glissandos, took on a new sweetness, especially at I once was lost, but now I'm found. We're in exile, he said to me of his band, several of whom commuted from Houston for a gig that brought in $8 at the door. But we're here. The message musicians had was that regardless of what else was lost, the music was back. As guitarist Todd Duke told me, this is the last thing I'm going to read for you now. It's important for people on the outside to realize that there's still a lot happening musically and culturally. A lot of musicians are here, and a lot of cats that aren't here are still coming into town and playing gigs and are on their way back. Bob French, the leader of the Tuxedo Jazz Band, added a New Orleans flourish. We'll be here, drunk or sober. So thanks for coming.
Statement.
And it says it all.
Yeah.
So I was hoping you all would have questions and we could have a conversation.
Where do you teach?
I teach in New Jersey at Rider University. I actually live in Manhattan, but I teach in New Jersey.
Come to New Orleans often?
I'm going 3 times this year. I try to come, as Brian can tell you, at least once a year.
Yeah.
First time I came was to his wedding in 1980. I think that's the first time.
Big mistake. Big mistake.
Oh, well.
And I've been coming ever since.
How did you first get interested in music down there?
It was just, I really came to his wedding and I went to Preservation Hall and it changed my life.
Yeah, I guess it did.
Because I always thought jazz was interesting, but not really for me. Classical music is my thing, and bluegrass, oddly enough. Those two things I love most. But all the jazz I'd heard was in New York, which is you can tell from this is very much the studiers, not the stompers. And then people sit and politely applaud, and it's like a graduate seminar. It's not like a party at all. So I thought that's what it was.
Oh, no.
And then I came to New Orleans, and it's just ignited my imagination and just kept bringing me back time after time after time. And then I conceived this class in 1990 called New Orleans, and I've been coming down with a group of college seniors ever since.
What are the new areas in New Orleans now to listen to?
What's that?
What are the new areas in New Orleans to listen to jazz? What are the areas that are still doing it? Frenchman Street? Or?
Yeah, I mean, all the things that I talked about here are still doing it. There are new clubs all the time. As soon as one closes, and everybody's very sad about it, new ones open. What I didn't read was that in the early 90s, which is I think when things started really changing dramatically, there were a bunch of clubs on Rampart Street. There was one called the Funky Butt Cafe. There was a beautiful place called Donna's. There was, what was the other one? It was mainly those two. And this was even before Irvin Mayfield's place on Bourbon Street. So there weren't many, but people went to those. There was the Howlin' Wolf. Those places allowed brass bands to develop a style. All the new brass bands would come into those places. And those groups all have very distinctive personalities now.
How did you find out about it?
Just word of mouth.
Yeah.
It really coming down.
Bar to bar?
I mean, the internet is both a curse and a blessing, because now you can find out about anything. Even now, I think it's hard to find out which ones are the real thing. But you just have to kind of experiment, ask locals. If locals go to them, it's a good sign.
Yeah.
And if it's especially if it's multi-ethnic locals, it's a very good sign. Any brand new clubs? I would say the Little Jim Saloon is a gem, as it says it is. It's where Louis Armstrong played when he was 14. And it's a beautiful place that was in a very bad part of town. It's gorgeously renovated. I'm actually doing a gig there on December the 13th, I think, book signing. And I would recommend that highly.
It's 3 blocks from my office.
Hey, tell people about it then.
Yeah, that's a nice place, yeah. Yeah, it opened not fairly recently.
Where?
The reason I knew about it is
Forger Street.
Herbert Ruffins told me about it before it
Yeah.
opened. And that's the way I found out about things. If you go backstage and talk with the musicians, they're very friendly, as you know. And it's not like New York at all. They're very happy to see you. There are no entourage, there are no brick walls to keep you from seeing them. And that's how I find out. I ask the musicians what the good places are.
What university are you in?
It's called Rider, R-I-D-E-R. And we're associated with Westminster Choir College, and I bring a lot of singers down. So they've been able to sing on some pretty great New Orleans gigs, and it's something that many of them have told me they've never forgotten. I've had a couple students move down here and never leave. They're still here, actually.
You a vocalist?
No, God, no. What else? And I wanted to say once again that one of the things that's in the book that I'm really proud of is that there's a whole chapter on opera. And I'm always amazed by how few people know how many opera houses there were in the New World, in New Orleans, before anybody. But Charleston is the only one that has anything like a rival history of opera. And John Boutte, I think I quoted Leroy Jones, a whole bunch of people say they're profoundly influenced by opera. And Louis Armstrong warmed up on opera arias when he performed. And there's a kind of lyricism and passion in opera. French and then Italian opera caught on here big time too. So there's a big chapter on that, and you can hear a lot of opera in New Orleans to this day.
Good.
And the other thing I didn't comment on that to me is important is that New Orleans is a place where you really want to be able to hear live music, that there's something about studio recordings do not do justice to it. And I know that's true of a lot of things, but it's really true of New Orleans music. And John Boutte told me he thinks that a recording studio is a prison.
Yeah, you don't get the personality.
And he says it's always so tempting, oh, I could do another take, I could do another take. He says it's better to be on a tightrope. And you don't get what I was reading about is this incredible audience in New Orleans. It gives back as much energy as it gets. You've got to see that, you've got to be there for that. You've got to be there for Shannon Powell doing what one of his colleagues calls a carnal interaction with his drum set. You don't get any of those things from a recording. You've got to be, you just got to be there. And Keith Jarrett said, jazz is in the moment, it's gone, that's it, end of story. It doesn't, you can record classical music and it's more of a recording in an authentic way than jazz or any of this music, because so much of it's improvised.
Yeah.
And in the moment, you just can't get that in a recording, it seems to me. It's a good archive. It's great to have archives, and I listen to this stuff all the time, but I'm always surprised the musicians who migrate to New Orleans. James Evans is a good example, clarinet player from England, and he said he was just blown away by how intense the music was. He had no idea. He said he listened to recordings, it's just not the same. Yeah.
Did you ever hear Lee Dorsey?
No.
It was not strictly jazz.
Rhythm and blues.
Rhythm
I think
and
while the
blues.
jazz recordings are tough to get and capture, fortunately New Orleans was able to capture the rhythm and blues music really well.
Yeah, never really want no.
But
I mean, I've
my
heard the
question,
name many times.
my question was, you should really, because there's a song where he shoots a gun
Yeah,
in
Ride
the
Your
middle,
Pony.
Ride Your Pony, and he shoots it 3 times. So I think
It's a cap gun, don't worry about it.
yeah, but being a New Orleanian and being a lover of jazz, I can tell you that there's a lot of violence in jazz. It's not all like a little fun day with the energy of the people. I mean, a lot of times when you have the second line, people run because they're shooting.
I remember I used to take a class to a place called Joe's Cozy Corner. Thank you. And the owner, his name was Joe Glasper. I mean, he packed a gun very visibly, and he protected us.
Yeah.
He would, if somebody would mess with us, we were a white crowd in a black place in those days. Now it's much more mixed, but he would just glower at them for 1 second, and they would back away real fast. But so I know that there's that undercurrent, if not overcurrent.
Did you ever come across Jules Kahn's photographs and films?
No.
They're in the historic New Orleans collection.
Good.
He spent a lifetime documenting bands like Olympia and following them everywhere. And go to this historic collection. They have everything that he did.
Both film and still photos.
This is at the Mint, right?
No, it's not in
Historic
the Mint.
collection.
It's on Royal. There are 2. There's an annex on. Where's the?
It's easy to find. It's in the French Quarter.
No. Let me just explain. The main one is on Royal, but most of the archives are on. It's the street behind the Royal Orleans Hotel,
Yeah.
where
I know
the
what you mean.
Napoleon House is.
Yeah.
It's on that street.
I didn't know about this. I'm getting time called on me, so
Okay.
thank all of you for coming. I really appreciate it.
Good luck.